Uh, just con just confirming that I'm audible. Cool. Great. Four things in this speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on how we capture these voters. Thirdly, on how this does not present any opportunity cost. And finally, on how we successfully do things like reduce populism. So firstly, on setup, just establishing what this actual targeting is likely to look like. I think the first thing to note here is that our underlying policy sets are not at all going to change for the very simple reason that our policy sets here already are likely to appeal to the interests of these less educated voters. It is not a question of whether or not we currently serve their interests. It is just simply a question of whether or not we are currently able to communicate that effectively in a way that is able to translate it to actually capturing their votes. So secondly, then, on what this campaigning is likely to look like in targeting in these less educated communities. And the first thing it looks like is just as generally targeting substantially more resources to these communities, which looks like actually sending delegates to do things like, host town hall meetings, etc., trying to communicate directly with prominent figures and community leaders. It looks like making targeted campaigns towards those groups specifically, instead of just doing like more generalized campaigns which don't specifically appeal to their needs in the same way. It looks like trying to ensure at all times rhetoric is largely plain spoken, is easily understandable by these types of communities, but as well as abandoning the types of rhetoric which make it seem as though the center-left party does not affiliate with less educated communities. So this is the type of rhetoric that does stuff like, say, intelligent voters vote left, or does things like make it look like we align more purely with more educated individuals already. And I think, and finally, it looks like trying to actively combat misinformation that is already targeted towards these communities. So first piece of substantive then on how we are actually able to capture these voters to begin with. So firstly here, on what do these voters currently look like? The first thing to note is that they are just substantially less politically active compared to other types of educated voters for a few reasons. Firstly, just being when you engage with the lower degrees of education, you're just substantially less likely to get the types of engagement which allow you to actually be educated on the significance of your own political decisions and the significance of your individual role within a political system. You're less likely to feel empowered with your voting, but you're also just less likely to be informed of the types of decisions you can make to begin with. You're just less involved in the discourse. Secondly, just the communities that you operate in are just engaged substantially less. But thirdly, you probably just have substantially less time and ability to engage with these types of things by nature of the fact that less educated people are often commiserately less well paid and often end up in situations where they just have less time due to having to work longer hours, to having and therefore having less ability to dedicate themselves to engaging in political causes. All of this is so substantially important because it means that the current and self-correcting mechanisms by which you would expect a person to typically vote in their own interests just simply don't work, because these people don't have the time or ability to engage to a level where they're able to get the sufficient levels of information which allow them to vote within their own interests. But secondly, because it often means that these people are sufficiently less politically engaged that they just do not vote at all, which was particularly harmful. Why then are we uniquely able to activate these voter bases? First thing to note here is just we are already the party that serves their interests better. It is just currently there is a failure to communicate those ideas particularly well, right? Because there's a failure to communicate things like, for example, the fact that left the stances on unionization under left-leaning parties do things like substantially empower workers, do things like protect jobs and workers' rights in a way that is incredibly beneficial to less educated voters. Similarly, things like climate policy and pollution really strongly affect things like agricultural output in ways that just simply are not communicated to these voters currently. Secondly, then, we just simply overcome the existing communication barriers and gaps that exist between in these communities, because we note that current sources of campaigning current current and methods of campaigning and current information and sources are just either less accessible or less targeted towards these groups currently. Like because these campaigns are often constructed in a way that are often already constructed by more highly educated people, and therefore aren't constructed in a way that it really brings the interest, bearing in mind how those campaigns are likely to be interpreted and understood by less educated individuals. Those perspectives aren't brought in, and therefore they just do not communicate as effectively. But as well as the fact that they just is not to the same extent an active attempt to level with them directly. So how do we overcome this then? And when we make an active attempt to target these communities, first of all, when you just make a much more targeted attempt here, it looks like kind of in person and present, and it looks like communicating very directly in a way that doesn't presuppose this pre-existing level of political engagement, right? Because when you're doing things like campaigning over news, and when you're doing things like campaigning through a policy specifically, that presupposes a level of engagement which requires them to already tune in. When you instead do things like try and directly meet with these communities, they don't need to have this pre-existing engagement. You're able to catch them so much more directly. But thirdly, then you simply do, regardless of the strength of your individual policies, you simply do things like increase trust within these communities. And this is particularly important because under both sides of the House, there are probably likely to be people that don't vote on the basis of policy, right? And this is particularly true for less educated communities. And there are always going to be a set of people who vote on how trustworthy they feel candidates to be, on how how much these candidates appear to care about these communities, and therefore we would always prefer these parties to make the active effort to appear trustworthy, to do things like engage on a human and level, to make the effort to show that they care. We know that these parties have this unique ability to do so because structurally left-leaning parties tend to be more well-funded because they mobilize their educated voter base for things like donations, and therefore you're just likely to do this at quite a large scale. I think this is just at the end of this, we show you we get more votes. We show but in particular, you get more votes in the areas that particularly matter, in the areas that were more likely to be marginal states. It's particularly because structurally democratic systems often still do things like over prioritize rural areas. All these reasons, we got you the votes and we got them in the areas that mattered. So secondly, then, on why there isn't an opportunity cost. First off, we just aren't changing the policies, and therefore we still appeal to the same groups of people. But secondly, just educated voters are less likely to be the voters that change their preferences to begin with. Firstly, noting that we're already the party that appeals to educated voters as most by virtue of our policies being good for them. But secondly, these are the groups who already were likely to do their own research, already likely to have entrenched preferences. And therefore, these were the groups that it was least futile to actually be actively campaigning towards. Finally, then, on reducing populism, we'll note that this is we'll note particularly important here, because although Democratic Party is probably care about winning elections, they also care about preserving those institutions overall. And we're able to do things like combat at incredibly populist policy by targeting these communities directly, and by combating things like misinformation and anti-establishment and sentiment. All these reasons, we got better electoral outcomes. We also preserved the interest of the party in the long term. So proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome first negative to begin their case.
Okay, hello. Can you just give me a moment? I really need to go to the bathroom. And just as proof that I'm not, sorry, excuse me, guys. Just as proof that I'm not typing, I'll just get to the bathroom. Hold the cups. Careful with the cup, please.
Part the first speaker is
Hi, just flagging that I do consent to recording if that's still something being done or something that is on the table. Where's my phone? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The numbers of affirmative policy do not lie, and they spell disaster for the center-left leaning party. There are 3 vibe checks I want to give to respond to the first affirmative speech. First vibe check. Is it really a matter of access? Are we actually going to meaningfully give these people information if we co-opt them under our party? First, we would suggest the degree to misinformation that is inside of them is not just a matter of access. Often, the information you may provide to them may be refuted. They still call it fake, partisan, biased. They may not be able to fully be able to absorb it because, as a matter of fact, they may not have the same degree of educational attainment as provided by other people. But second of all, even if first affirmative does not directly tie this benefit to any structural reason or an exclusive benefit, and therefore, we are not likely to fully credit this argument. The second thing is that on their end, affirmative has to concede at some point that there is a cost, because for campaign managers and candidates, these people cannot be in 2 places at once. So obviously, if you were naturally to do a campaign rally, for example, within a university because you wanted to tap into educated people, obviously you will have to forgo that in favor of going to areas and communities with low educational attainment. What do we want to do on side negative instead? Obviously, maintain status quo, double down on the existing educated base. Since we're a center-left-leaning party, we will also double down on minorities and other similar attributes. But we also want to pursue things like make college and education, making it more accessible so that we still continue to benefit from the trend of individuals becoming more educated and as a result, deciding to vote Democrat. The second vibe check is affirmative says not all less educated voters are conspiracy theorists, but structurally they are more likely to be. Why? First of all, less educated people do not undergo media literacy training inherent to the educational curriculum. Therefore, they're less critical, they're more likely to be vulnerable to misinformation and alternative truth. But second, even if they're likely to co-opt them into the party anyway, you may still be appealing to them because when you're promoting towards the reasonable uneducated people, you may still co-opt the conspiracy theorists because the messaging still applies of rejecting establishment, of some economic and labor policy, and this is assuming the best case of side affirmative. The last vibe check I want to give is that they suggest that, well, if we take away resources from pandering to educated people, we're not likely to lose them anyway because they're a strong voter base. This is untrue with current political trend. First of all, Republicans are currently trying to appeal to them. This is case in point, for example, what's happening currently in the US, since they understood that a lot of educated people, for example, were currently trying to go to Biden instead of Trump. Second of all, there's a micro skill analysis with regards to a lot of the parents of the educated, for example, those that benefit from conservatism, those that benefit from republicanism are trying to push them, for example, towards becoming more leaning right. There are also things like smear campaigns that may also still affect the educated, even if it's not something that is within the realm of conspiracy theory. The first thing I want to prove is that you will not sway these uneducated people. There are a few reasons why they're not incentivized to sway. First, diametrically opposed views. For example, whether or not college is important and whether or not it matters is something that disagree upon. Second, there's a lot of massive distrust because uneducated people often see center-leaning left politicians as self-serving opportunists. Third, they often operate on a different understanding of truth, ranging from more moderate examples such as being an anti-vaxxer to more radical versions like being a conspiracy theorist or an incel. Fourth, even if this is about uneducated youth, they may still be heavily influenced by their families who are also unlikely to be educated because these characteristics are often intergenerational. Fourth, this often self-perpetuating in ways that the center-left-leaning party cannot control. You cannot control their individual social media feeds. You cannot control the obscure forms of news that they consume. This means that on affirmative, there are plenty of resources you waste trying to win over this voter base. You will choose to travel and set up events and advertisements in states with low educational attainment rates, but this is terrible for affirmative because there's a massively high barrier getting them to vote for you. We don't think that first affirmative fulfills that barrier. This is important because the ability to win elections is contingent on the ability to sway these individuals. The second thing I want to prove, given that we prove that you won't sway these individuals, is that in the attempt of trying to sway these individuals, you will lose out on your existing voter base. The first thing I want to prove is that we create in fighting.
First reason, if we believe the best case of affirmative policy, we will have to antagonize them, tell them they are wrong. But even if we don't outwardly try to antagonize them, they tend to automatically become defensive and feel as if we're calling them stupid. Second of all, there's a lot of infighting within the party when they harass educated voters, when they harass minorities because they still hold stigmas like misgendering queer people, generally making a lot of our very core voter base feel very unsafe within our own spaces. Third, this is often exploited and highlighted by the media, wherein we are misconstrued as unreasonable individuals. And note that this doesn't need to be a common thread. Just one instance of harassment, the media can blow it up immensely. The fourth reason is we have completely different interests. Many educated people want to advocate for the acceptance of gender minorities and other protected identities that educated people largely have yet to comprehend and advocate for. Fifth, it's not just that their interests are different, but it's the way in which they choose to advocate and argue for their interests is often done in the most vitriolic and antagonistic way possible. Some of the educated often use classist rhetoric. Some of the uneducated often use slurs and other very harmful rhetoric. So these are 5 structural reasons. Affirmative cannot just respond to one to beat out the argument. They have to respond to all 5 to beat out the argument completely. The next thing I want to prove is as a result of this, we lose voters. First, because of backlash, because our branding of being open-minded, critical, rational, go down the drain. And best case, we are perceived at least as fragmented, which is already quite bad. Second of all, there's backlash by association because we're co-opting the supporters that are allegedly supposed to go to Trump. The people, for example, who are perceived as responsible for the Capitol riots and all those other things. Second of all, in affirmative's best case, minorities and educated people who are currently at our core just feel unsafe. In the worst case, they opt out of polling and other things like that. This is how we incapacitate the party. The first way is that we get less funding because educated voters often come from wealth, have high-paying jobs, understand the financial demands of operating as a party, and therefore are more likely to continuously and sustainably donate. Second, people may not necessarily change votes and become a Republican, but they may show up less to rallies. They may not openly endorse their political party on social media. This is necessary because these are the methods by which we gain more supporters, gain votes, gain critical mass. While we do gain the less educated in the best case of affirmative, we lose the educated, the media behind them, and the money that could have gone into campaigns. This is not just zero sum, and first affirmative lies when they argue that there's no opportunity cost. The last thing I want to argue is on the counterfactual. So why is our world comparatively better? The first thing I want to say is that there is no urgency to make a pivot. The first thing we suggest is that the info slide already says that educational rates are going up. And insofar as we're having more people in center left leaning, for example, parties and politicians go occupy seats in Congress, for example, occupy seats in legislation, this means that the mechanisms by which we allow more people to have an education, so making college free, for example, more accessibility of diversity quotas for certain universities, this means that this is an increasing trend that's likely to occur. Affirmative has to give structural reasons for why that's not true. But the affirmative model derails the exclusive benefits from status quo. Insofar as we're less likely to succeed, more likely to be a fragmented party, it means that we're less likely to elect in the congressmen and the candidates that give us those accessible education policies. And that's how it becomes harder to make education accessible and free for all. And that's how the democratic backsliding occurs. The last note I want to have is the counterfactual on democracy. Even if they achieve getting these people, first of all, a lot of these individuals are anti-adversaries to not understanding democracy because they don't understand due process or combating misinformation and why that matters. But second of all, they often have a history of becoming antithetical to democracy via Capitol riots, contesting electoral process, and becoming a nuisance in some elections. For all these reasons and more, clear negative ballot.
I'll thank first negative for that speech and welcome second affirmative to continue Af's case.
Sorry, just give me 1 second to get my paper together. Double checking I can be heard. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, they're right when they say that there must be some cost involved in this debate and there must be time spent campaigning with educated voters, with uneducated voters. We gave you analysis for first, though, about why that time spent would simply be more effective. And none of that analysis actually gets responded to. The only analysis they give is like uneducated voters are dumb and always listen to misinformation. That was reductive. That never actually responded to the analysis that we gave you in a meaningful way. And so we were still ahead even after first negative. Firstly, on their counterprop, they say that they're going to double down on getting more educations. The obvious response to give to this is it's just symmetric, right? Because it's not a problem of literally being able to misunderstand your policies. It's a problem of identity that the center-left parties see, portray themselves as being only for educated voters, and if you're an uneducated voter, you are not welcome in the party. And we explain how that's ingrained in their rhetoric, and that's actually supported by first negative when they say that they use things like slurs against uneducated voters, which is exactly why even as general educational attainment gets better, that identity actually moves symmetrically, and you do not marginally win voters, as I say. Okay, firstly, on whether or not we are actually able to win votes, comparing then that to how many votes we're actually going to lose, and finding the material about populism that goes absolutely unresponded to after first negative. Firstly, on whether we're actually going to win votes, we gave you a few very simple mechanisms that got no response. And I think the biggest win was simply that educated voters are just more likely to vote autonomously on their own because they research things like policy preferences, which is exactly why when we gave you so much analysis about why these like uneducated voters probably were represented in our policy and that was unresponded to, we were still ahead in this. Why did they say that we were unable to win these voters? Firstly, they said that access was not the problem. The problem was misinformation, because you apparently need like education and training to be able to understand if something is true or not. One, we provide the solution to this in our prop when we say that we're going to do things like send people to these communities to communicate ways which is effective them, and also communicate in ways which is responsive to strategies which actually work to get information across the line. Moreover, though, we explain why leaving people happy to keep accepting misinformation is actually a bigger problem. So we explain that there is there's a foot in the door effect when you set up, for instance, a presence in this local community. You're able to do things like slowly whittle down the extent to which other communities which prosper, spread things like information are actually effective. And secondly, the same analysis responds to all their mechanisms about why you're just like actually unable to absorb this information, because we were probably able to communicate things like, hey, if you do not oppose climate change, there will continue to be freak weather events, which means your agricultural yields will go down. If you're not unionized, you will simply get low wages at your jobs. That was all material that was like definitely plausible to explain to these people, and that was absolutely insane to say that we could not. What else did they say? They gave you supposedly 6 mechanisms. Only 5 of them were real. I'm going to explain why they're all symmetric or do not work. Firstly, they say you diametrically oppose, which is unresponsively to Alex's material about how this policy is good. Secondly, they say that there is like a basic hate of this party. Thirdly, they say that they oppose the truth. Fourthly, on family influence. Fifthly, on social media perpetuation. Panel, the mechanisms about how you hate the other party, about how you have family influence, and about how social media perpetuates external narratives also explains why we don't lose educated voters. All those mechanisms were symmetric. They actually just access more media, which is why those mechanisms were stronger on our side. But finally, I explain why all the material and why you oppose the truth is insane. Because if year on year your agricultural yields gets worse and worse because you keep degrading your soil, it's kind of hard to reject the truth. That is why we were actually the side which were able to flip these mechanisms when they were not symmetric. Panel, what was the impact of this? We told you firstly, we get more votes. But secondly, even if there was a symmetric trade-off between uneducated voters and educated voters, we explained that we were winning the important votes because democratic systems overrepresented rural communities where these uneducated voters typically came from, because we were already taking bigger margins in the cities where we were happy to lose because these voting systems do not work on a popular vote. They're about winning electorates, which is why we win things like swing states, which is why we win things like swing states. But finally, because when voters form their preferences, not of who actually does better policy, but of things like how much osmosis and communication you have with those campaigners, that was when you were actually able to swing voters. Like highly educated voters who have clear set policy preferences, which is simply less likely to be swung than these people, which is why they're actually better. But finally, we brought you an independent benefit about how you are now better able to gauge the preferences of these communities, because obviously center-left parties do also care about enacting good policy, especially because they do care about things like uplifting the poor, who probably do associate with people who are uneducated. And for that simple reason, if you, for instance, get engagement from people who are uneducated in your policy meetings, when you're describing the ways and the type of campaign you should do, that is also something you care about because you're now able to help this community, which is obviously in your aims. Okay, let's compare this then to how many people are actually going to lose. First piece of analysis they give about why there is cost is obviously true. You can't be in 2 places at the same time. But what else do they actually give, which is mechanistically useful. Firstly, they say that Republicans are campaigning to win educated voters. This doesn't actually prove anything about the marginal propensity and ability of them to win this, especially because they don't describe where there's a tipping point about like how much conversation they're having. The analysis we gave you at first, which literally went unresponded to, is that comparatively, educated voters form their policy preferences of things like which of their voting preferences of who had better policy, which was exactly why it didn't matter if Republicans were now able to do comparatively more advertising towards these people, because compared to uneducated voters, that was going to be less effective in swaying their preferences. What else did they say? Firstly, they said there was going to be infighting because like now people who wanted to portray the party as being super high education had to be like defensive or had to antagonize. One, seems like we probably have enough fiat to say that this would be a whole movement thing. But secondly, like also does not seem as bad as the party being attacked for being the exclusively pro-education party if you believe that that's a problematic thing. Secondly, they say the uneducated necessarily oppose the voter base. For example, in the use like the extent to which they do things like misgendering, etc. Firstly, I think that the voter base who is affected by things like misgendering probably really appreciate us going into these communities and trying to do things like uplift education and trying to do things like convey how these issues are important, which is exactly what our prop was, which explains why we are the side which actually fixes all these kind of issues. But also, we're obviously able to communicate the efficacy of these policies in particularly effective ways, because if you're politically switched on, but also if you're the kind of person that gets to like really, really affected by identity politics, you probably are also involved in the party, which is exactly why you're the most likely to see the ways in which this is long-term beneficial for you. Thirdly, they say the media is going to look you dumb. This was, one, not responsive to Alex's material about how it was actually easier to latch onto narratives about how you were the party which shirked the average American because you were the party that was only for the rich elite that did not understand the poor and that was out of touch. And so there was actually far more likely on their side that the media was going to dunk on you. But finally, they say that you had to use slurs against these communities when you were campaigning. Well, panel, we just oppose this because we say it is disutile to your ability to win elections. The only piece of weighing they gave you was like, well, these people donate more to you because they are highly educated. But obviously the kind of person who donates is so entrenched in your party that they are not the kind of person that you're likely to lose, and is also the kind of person who is likely to appreciate this move if we prove it is strategic. Panel, we have done that time and time over. On the margins, the amount of time you spend in these communities is simply going to be more effective with people who form their preferences based on how much they see your party, based on how much they trust your party. Finally, though, on populism, we brought you the very simple idea that you should prevent the ability of populist leaders to succeed. To explain that populist leaders only work when there is a lack of information or when there is the ability to spread misinformation, I give you the mex why we stopped that at my first speech. That means that, for example, when politicians like Trump say, I'm going to inject massive amounts of money into the economy, people do not vote for him because you're able to explain the ways in which in the long term that leads to massive things like inflation. And that means that populist campaigners don't win, which is one, good for your voter base, but two, is good for democracy, because obviously you want to be able to engage in an effective democratic system into the future. And if populist candidates threaten that, that is the ultimate threat which you have to oppose. But panel, compare which party you are more likely to win. It has to be people which do not do the research on their own.
I'd like to take second affirmative for that speech and welcome second negative to continue next case.
Audible? They're just
Sorry, it's going to take me a hot second to set up my paper just because there's so much of it. It's good. Okay. What the opposition needed to realize is when you don't encourage people who otherwise wouldn't have access to education to educate themselves, you necessarily get the election of candidates that harm democracy. That looks like the election of Trump. That looks like the election of the current Italian Prime Minister, because when you don't provide people the information that would help them combat misinformation, you empower populist candidates that literally nuke democracy. They have not responded to this. It is too late for them to respond to this because we told you down the bench that this was incredibly, insanely harmful for these reasons. Okay, now, do you get less educated voters? Do you get more educated voters? First, on less educated voters. I think just the first thing to say is that the negative is insanely uncharitable to uneducated people. Because that analysis on why uneducated people were likely, you couldn't sway them, relies on the fact that they can't learn, rather than what we say, which is people haven't had access to opportunities or access to information that allows them to learn and thus make better decisions, right? Because the claims they make, like about using misinformation or using slurs or not understanding democracy, rely on this communication gap, right? Because you never had any counter messaging against this misinformation. You never had anyone who stepped in and told you about like the rights of communities that you might not have otherwise interacted with. You never had anyone who stepped in and told you how to engage with democracy. Like, it wasn't like, how do you engage with democracy if no one ever told you? It wasn't because these people were dumb or functionally unable to learn. It was because they were deeply underserved and neglected. Being low educated means you can't realize your political beliefs. It doesn't mean that you're inherently far right or inherently hateful. What we explain to you is that, like, on our side of the debate, we give people the skills to realize their political beliefs. And we explain to you that these political beliefs were likely to align with those of our party. Because if you are someone who is less educated, you probably perhaps might care for things about educational access for your children so they can have the opportunities you never had. You might care about things like unionization that allows you to get the workplace rights that would fundamentally change your life. You might care about things like access to welfare because you have less high-paying jobs and are vulnerable to economic downturn. Also, even if you didn't believe that these people would be interested in these policies, we don't need to engage in everything in their value set. Even if you believe that less educated voters were like violently racist and homophobic, we just need to prove to them that the economic benefits we perhaps provide, we have some stuff that is more useful to them, especially in disengaged communities where they just might simply not know that these policies existed in the first place. They might not literally know what your policies are. You just say, we have a list of things that are really useful to you. You don't, in the instance where these communities are so violently awful and homophobic, you don't have to engage in that messaging at all. You just point out the things that are good, but we tell you that these communities are unlikely to be in this way because of all of the reasons that I just gave you, right? Also, we thought that people didn't engage with lies and with information because they thought they were true. It's just that they never got provided the information, which was to combat this lie, which was often information that was hard to understand because you had to understand how to read a research paper or how to read the news or how to engage with further things that these people were just not provided or not engaged with in the status quo. When you're a political candidate and you come in and you make these things really clear to people, you engage with them on a human level, you answer their questions in ways that are really charitable, that is what actually changes the way that these people think. Someone finally listening to them. Then what the opposition tries to tell us, is this is a shrinking group of people, right? But obviously, so you're always less educated in relative to someone else. We want this to sound right. It used to be that finishing high school meant you were highly educated. Now it's about finishing university. There are always people who are less educated, who are more left out of the educational system. So you always want to appeal to these people, right? Even if you believed that claim and that there were fewer less educated people, then we also just explained to you why they were in the areas that you necessarily needed to win the most, right? That was key areas like rural areas, for example, which were disproportionately represented in things like Senate. But we also told you that on issues like misinformation, you can do things like put a foot in the door so you have a community leader who's now on your side and helps press against information in that community. We tell you can do things like when you hear the opinions of less educated people who want to help with your policy, you can create policy that is more beneficial to you. We just told you that these people were less politically active, not because they were dumb, not because they were malicious, but because they had less access to information, because they had less time, and because no one had ever tried to help them realize their political beliefs and leanings, often political beliefs and leanings that actually did really align with these center-left parties, right? We explained that these people are unable to self-correct against harmful policies because no one gave them the information. The opposition never sufficiently responded to this analysis that was key in explaining the motivations of these people. We were the most charitable to people who are undereducated. We explained that there are nuanced characterization of their beliefs and motivations, and we explained the ways in which we could message to them really, really effectively. So now on whether or not you get educated voters. I think there's a couple of things to say. I think the first thing is that educated voters tend to have quite entrenched political beliefs, right? Like if you are center-left, right, or really left, who are you going to go and vote for instead? very unclear. It is not like the votes turn to the other side, right? At worst, maybe we win our election in California by 60%, not 70%. The marginal change is that we perhaps win by slightly less in areas that we were going to win anyway. And by spending that time in a community who otherwise would have no access to political engagement, what we do is we maybe increase a marginal seat by a couple percentage points, tipping that seat in our favor, actually making a substantive difference to like the composition of the House or the Senate in whatever democracy you're engaging with, right? Because even though there was this opportunity cost, going to talk to a university in California where 70% of people already agreed to doesn't help as much as going to an underserved community in Idaho and going to a town hall and answering all their questions to help them understand how democracy works, to help them understand how issues work, to help tell them how their corn crops are going to be really damaged by climate change in a couple of years, because they never had access to that information because no one ever told them what they didn't know. Obviously, educated voters still had reasons to vote for you. They just tell us then that we would target moderates instead. Moderates are the reasonable voters to engage with. But the issue they don't understand is that the reasons why we can still target educated voters are also the reasons why we can still target moderates, right? These are the things we tell you at first from Alex, right? Because there is no substantial change in policy. And these are people who are likely, okay, maybe we don't campaign as intensely to our moderates, maybe we don't campaign as intensively to our policy documents. These are people who cared about their vote. These are people who would do their own research, who would understand your policy to the conclusion that your policies were still the best for them. Just because you didn't go and talk to them didn't mean these people were not still going to be politically engaged. And to the extent that they were politically engaged, they probably still voters to still retain those seats whilst actually using some time to help people who are less educated and to actually make a change. Because what we tell you is that people's preferences are probably quite good for your party. People who are, who are already center left and educated are still going to be center left and educated. People who are undereducated often have beliefs that are very center left. What we told you was we gave people who didn't have access to information provision, the information provision that allowed them to literally access democracy, allow them to vote for your parties, and allow them to vote for your parties in locations that were incredibly utile and strategic. Because we proved to you that we engage better with both sets of voters and we engage better with more important voters, we are so, so proud to affirm.
Alex, take good affirmative for that speech, and welcome third negative to close the substantive portion of this debate.
We're just reading in the other laptop. Just give us a second.
Audible and visible. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Oh, I also do not consent to recording.
Oh, sorry. So you're a bit crackly. Did you consent or did you not consent?
Did not consent to recording.
Okay, I'm gonna pause it now.
Hello. Okay. Three, two, one, let's go. On the basis of what is good internally for the political party and what is good outside of the political party, side negative wins on both fronts and therefore will win this 8th round of Australs 2022. The first thing I want to talk about is the theme within the concept of the party. The first win condition that side affirmative relies upon is that this individual, or allowing these individuals to enter our party, will mean that our candidates will be elected. Third affirmative finally gives the specific reason that they give us that some of these individuals have children that they believe deserve more opportunities, and therefore they want to advocate for the center left-leaning party because the center-leaning left will give them more education. First of all, other than the fact that this is massively unproven, it's also massively outweighed by our multiple structural reasons for why they are less likely to opt in. So the opposed views, the distrust, the different planes of reality, the fact that you cannot control their continuous influx of news sources that tell them that your party are a bunch of opportunists, that your party works for the deep state, and other things like that. Second of all, they do not dispute these reasons sufficiently. Therefore, at the end of the day, these structural reasons and the idea that we are less likely to win an election using this voter base is something that goes towards side negative. The second condition that they have is that we will change these people and they will turn from uneducated individuals to educated individuals. First, they do not disprove the high barrier to changing the way they think. The response from second affirmative was, well, it's symmetric, without much explanation of why my 5 structural reasons were symmetric. The closest thing to an explanation from them was that if uneducated people have conservative and Republican parents, therefore they themselves are conservative and Republican, educated people have liberal parents, therefore they will also continue to be liberal. But the problem with this analysis is that it doesn't even listen to our structural reason. What we were arguing was that educated people have conservative parents that benefited from right-wing fiscal policy that are compelling them to still vote for Republican parties because that's what's going to protect their elite system. Assume the best case that they do change and educated people within the party do appreciate it, but why should this be done via co-opting them into our party? There is no explanation for why this is exclusive. We say we already advocate for, making education cheaper. We advocate for public schooling and allowing people to enter these schools, for example. As a matter of fact, in the last part of my speech, I suggested that if you allow these people to enter, it compromises our electability, and that's how we're less likely to have more Democrats or more left-wing individuals in Congress, in legislature, advocating for more accessible education, and that's how democratic backsliding occurs. We also say on first neg, there is media backlash. On second neg, we can use this money elsewhere, other states, other demographics that are less controversial. We don't understand the exclusivity. There is no sufficient weighing on why the risks do not outweigh the harms. The last thing we explain is who exactly matters more, because affirmative is implying that the uneducated are more important. We say that the educated and by consequence also minorities are also more important because first of all, they're more likely to give money. And while affirmative says that they will donate either way, what we try to say it's about personal accounts. It's about extents. There is a meaningful difference between donating $10 because you don't vibe with the Democratic Party anymore versus donating $100 because you understand that at the end of the day, they still advocated for your interest and safe spaces. Second of all, it's the idea that we are the only ones who can advocate for their interest, safe spaces when the Republicans cannot. So on our end, they have less time to galvanize on negatives. The next thing is, how do people respond outside? They counter-argue that people will be angrier, other than the fact that this is underbuilt and we don't understand the full impact of how, to what degree they'll be angry. We explicitly say that there's media backlash, that people will feel unsafe, there will be distrust because people will be harassed, there's a lot of classist rhetoric. The magnitude of impact on our end is clear. And given that there's no weighing mechanism on why the anger on side affirmative is more likely, you have to judge this on the basis of who proves it better and who proves the party's interest better. Negative does both. This ballot should be for negative.
I'd like to thank Neg Reply for that speech and welcome Af Reply to close the debate.
Checking I can be heard.
Yup.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Alex told you at first affirmative that there was a set of uneducated people who were not enfranchised enough to vote because no one told them that they were powerful. We said that we would tell them that they could vote and it was useful and that they would vote for us. We already had on winning votes. Firstly, on the imperative. Our setup made it quite clear that this was about the identity of relativity because there was a set of narratives about how the center left was for educated people and it was not representative of people who are less educated. That was why we explained this from second and third, that all their analysis about the increasing proportion of educated people did not matter, because a set of people would still fall into that identity, and thus the imperative did exist and will continue to exist for a significant period of time. Secondly, then, I'm going to give direct comparisons of which team in this debate is actually able to win votes. The first metric upon which you can win more votes is the people who do more research. And note, we give you explicit reasons why the uneducated people were the biggest group who did the least research, even if they tried to counterprop that you would go to other groups. We said that these people are almost never going to do research, which is exactly why under our side, we would provide information specifically on how our policies were good for them. Comparatively, people who were educated probably already knew about our policies and the ways in which they were good and were likely to have formed that idea anyway. But uneducated people perhaps did not know the way in which other parties' policies were good for them, but at least in the status quo never knew how our policies were good for them. That was an instant way in which we swung votes. Comparatively, and secondly, the mechanism upon lines of values of trust. And again, we said that uneducated people were the people that voted most along lines of trust and presence. We said that under the status quo, you were simply not present in these communities, which was exactly why they did not trust your party, when that was an axis upon which they were far more likely to vote than policy, given they literally did not know what policy you stood for. That was why we said that your presence in these communities mattered more than your presence in educated communities, because they were just simply more likely to vote for this reason. At the end of that, we've already proven why you get more votes, because the more important thing is that you let educated communities do their research and you enable uneducated communities to trust you. And that was how you actually won votes. Furthermore, thirdly, on policy alignment. Firstly, this is obviously downstream of the two things that we just described, because insofar as at least some people had policy alignment with you, we actually activated this. But insofar as we described from Alex, that a set of people were never voting on their policy because they just would not do the research in either world, we were now able to win them over in trust. But beyond this, we gave you a simple set of things in which your policy aligns. But moreover, we said that if it was true that you were campaigning, that you voted because, for instance, you believe in, queer rights and all those kind of things, you were just never going to leave the center left because you would entrench that belief upon your policy preference, which is exactly why we were able to win a set of people, but we're structurally less likely to lose people. Finally, though, on this claim that they simply cannot understand our policies, we gave you reasons that they could understand. All you need to do is slow down rather than adopting the status quo stance of trying to make things as intelligent, as smart as possible, which is exactly why we could convey this information. And panel, I really hate when people say this in reply, but every single other mechanism is symmetric. The only axis upon which you can prove that you are more or less likely to win a certain party is depending on which party votes more on policy and more on trust. We do that, we prove you get more votes. Even if you don't believe that, why are our votes more important? One is from swing electorates, which, opposing to their assertion, happens in most liberal democracies, in the UK, in Germany, in Australia, in the US. So this mechanism stands in most instances. But secondly, it's from rural communities that, again, in all Senate-based electorate systems, were overrepresented in terms of the popular vote. That means that when we were able to cater to them, we simply got more power in parliaments. Finally, though, I'm going to list off 3 slam dunk impacts that didn't get a single response in this debate. Firstly, your party now looks consistent because you don't ignore a group who is disenfranchised, even though you supposedly are the other party that stands for disenfranchised people. Secondly, you get better policy formation, you're actually able to help people more. Thirdly, you prevent the rise of populism and the degradation of democracy. Not a single response as to any of those impacts down this entire neg bench. If you believe that voting is close, you must give us the win on that. Panel, we were the only team that actually gave a realistic account of why these uneducated people did not vote for you in the status quo. You must give us the win.